In the previous module, we introduced the store object to manage the state of this application, and we added a lookup author method on that object. We needed to use this lookup author method in the article component. So we had to pass down the store object from the app component to the article component, passing it through the article list component as well. However, the article list component didn't really need this store object. The question was, how can we make the article component use the store object without having the article list component deal with it? The answer is simply make it into a global variable. But since this store object is associated with an instance of the app component, we need a global object associated with that instance. React has a solution for that. It's the powerful Context API. The React documentation warns about using the Context API for good reasons. The context object is, after all, a global concept, and anything global should be avoided if possible. However, I think it's important to understand the Context API, especially if you're using a library that uses it, like Redux or React Router. So I'll show you how to use the Context API, and I'll then tell you what libraries like Redux do to make you avoid the direct use of the Context API, which the React documentation warns that it's not stable and might change. So the goal is we want the application to continue to work without this line here in article list component. Removing this line will break the application. Here's how we can use the Context API to fix that. In the app component, we need to define the context object. We do that with a getChildContext function. Whatever we return from this function will be our context object. So we're going to return the store, which is a property on this app component. So this.props.store, just like that. Now, to make the Context API work, we need to define the context type. We do that with a static property here in the app component, child context types. For every element of this new context that we're introducing, we have to specify a type. So the store, for example, is an object. So we can use the prop types library to do that, proptypes.object. Of course, we need to import prop types. And that's it. That's all we need to do to make the store part of the Context API, which can be globally available to any component within the React application. Now, for every component that needs to use this context, like for example, the article component, we also need to define the context types here. So article.context types, very similar to prop types. And in here, we define that the store is an object using the prop types library as well. And just by doing so, we declare that this article component is allowed to use this context object, which has the store object globally defined on it. So a function component can access the context object using its second argument here. So the first argument is the props, and the second argument is the context. And now, instead of reading the store from the props, we can read it directly from the context. So context.store. Let's make sure that things are rendering, and looks like they are. So let's review this really powerful Context API. We define a getChildContext function. In that function, we return exactly the context object that we want to be globally available for every component. In our case, we just defined the store. We also have to define the context types. In here, we do child context types, and we define the type of every element on that context. Then inside the component, we also define what types from the context that we want to access. And then in the second argument for a function component, we can access the context. We can actually destructure the store here directly if you want to, which would allow us to just use it directly here as well.